The Last of the Apache Chief. John Clum was assigned to take the Chiricahua Indians to San Carlos, which is where the White Mountain Reservation was. When he arrived, he was surprised to find Taza, the son of Cochise and the chief of the Chiricahua Cooperative. Taza, like his father, only wanted peace. Only half of his tribe agreed, and when Clum went to the reservation to round up the ones that stayed behind, he found it empty. The Indians escaped to Mexico. They were led by a 46-year-old Badongaho Apache. He followed Cochise when he was younger and considered himself a Chiricahua. His name was Goyeth Lay, better known as Geronimo. Taza and the ones that followed him arrived at San Carlos. They were not very warm to Clum or any other white man. Clum decided to take some Apaches on a tour of the East. He secured permission from the Indian Bureau to take 22 Apaches and invited Taza. He thought this would gain the trust of some of his tribe, but it failed. Taza died of pneumonia on the trip. When Clum returned without Taza, the Indians instantly lost any trust of the white man. During the winter of 1876 and 77, some of the Indians that followed Geronimo would slip into the reservation. They told stories of the raids and wealth they were accumulating at Ojo Caliente. The news soon reached the army, and they sent Clum to arrest Geronimo and any other renegades and bring them to White Mountain. Clum arrived and asked for counsel with Geronimo and Victorio, the chief of another tribe. Geronimo and Victorio agreed and were arrested on the spot. They, along with all the others, were sent to White Mountain. Victorio was released, but Geronimo was sentenced to the guardhouse. Victorio and most of the other Apaches were moved to San Carlos in the spring of 1877. For a few weeks, it seemed as though the Apache community moved to White Mountain Reservation were continuing peace. With a large amount of Indians on one reservation, the army grew concerned. They sent a company of soldiers to Fort Thomas. This made the Indians nervous and Clum furious. He asked that the army move the soldiers, but they declined. Clum soon resigned, but was angry that the Indian leader, like Geronimo, were too reactionary to take the white man's road. Clum went to Tombstone, Arizona, and founded a crusading newspaper, Epitaph. Back at the reservation, at the end of the summer of 1877, things began to fall apart. With the numbers increasing and the rations decreasing, Victorio decided to leave his band out of the reservation back to Ojo Caliente. In the late 1878, the army received orders to take them back. After begging, Victorio realized that he had no choice but to let the women and children go. He took his men and fled into the mountains. After a hard winter, he offered to surrender if their families would be released from White Mountain. The army compromised and let them live in New Mexico. In the summer of 1879, an old charge of horse stealing was brought up against him. He escaped the reservation and vowed to never trust a white man again. He set up a fort in Mexico and started recruiting and plundering. The United States and Mexico agreed to cooperate to bring him down. On October 14, 1880, they ambushed the Indians, killing Victorio and all but 30 Indians. Among the Indians who fled was Nana, a 70-year-old Membrace warrior. Nana started to recruit from nearby reservations and raid, although nowhere near White Mountain, his feats were told there. Back at White Mountain, rumors spread saying that any leader who had ever been hostile would be arrested. Geronimo and about 70 other Indians decided to leave the reservation and slipped away to Mexico. 6 months later, well armed, they returned to San Carlos to free the others. When they left, the army quickly pursued them. The Mexicans ambushed the front, killing most of the women and children. Geronimo and a few others escaped and joined Nana and his guerrillas. It became a war of survival. Back at the reservation, the army continued to bring in soldiers after each outbreak. The increase in soldiers brought more unrest among the Apaches, who led to more Indians leaving. The army resigned General George Crook to stop the chaos. He found out the feeling of distrust for the white man existing among all the Apaches. The Indians did not know who to believe and were quickly coming to the conclusion that it would be better to die fighting than to slowly be destroyed by captivity. Crook quickly realized that the Indians were being mistreated and their rations stolen. Crook demanded complete cooperation from the government for reforms to begin. The Apaches were skeptical, but Crook soon proved his trustworthiness. Peace started to come again to the reservation, but the Indians could not forget that their relatives in Mexico were completely free. The government was afraid that raids would begin again from Mexico and cause friction in the reservations, so they made an agreement with the Mexican government permitting soldiers to cross borders in pursuit of hostile Apaches. Crook still believed he could convince guerrilla leaders, including Geronimo, to submit without violence. Geronimo talked with Crook several times, but they did not come to an agreement. Geronimo liked Crook's straight talk, but wanted to test it before he followed him back to the reservation. He wanted to gather all his people, but would send the woman, children, and some of his warriors back with Crook. Crook agreed, and Geronimo and Caydos crossed the border 8 months later in February 1884. For over a year, the Indians lived peacefully with Crook overseeing the reservations. Outside the reservations and army posts, there was criticism that Crook was too lenient on the Indians. The newspapers began telling stories with exaggerations and falsehoods about the Indians. They especially focused on Geronimo, which caused vigilantes to cry for him to hang even if the government wouldn't do it. With these rumors swirling, most of the harvest was done. The Indians grew discontented. The Indian men started spending time gambling, quarreling, and drinking. On May 17th, Geronimo, Mangus, Chihuahua, and Nana decided to go to Mexico after drinking heavily. In the group were 92 women and children, 8 boys, and 32 men. Many reasons were given by both the whites and Indians for their sudden departure, but it was a rash decision based on rumors of arrest. The flight of Geronimo's party was a signal for an outpouring of wild rumors across the state of Arizona and the nation. Geronimo was trying to avoid any confrontation with the white citizens and quickly get across the border to Mexico. Crook was trying to avoid a huge military operation to get them back while trying to balance the demands of Washington. As autumn approached, Crook crossed the border to Mexico with explicit orders to kill the fugitives or take their unconditional surrender. Caught between Mexicans who wanted to kill them and Americans who wanted to make them prisoners, Geronimo decided to once again talk to Crook. On March 25, 1886, the Indians decided to surrender after 3 days of emotional talks. Crook told them they must surrender without conditions, but the leaders would not surrender unless they were assured that they would be returned to their families after 2 years of imprisonment. Crook made the deal, feeling that Washington would consider this a deal since they did surrender. Crook hurried to telegraph the surrender terms he had agreed to back to Washington. To his dismay, the terms were not accepted. Once the Indian leaders heard what happened, Geronimo and Nachi escaped and were headed back to Mexico. On their way, a trader supplied them with whiskey and lied about them being hung if they were caught in Arizona. As a result of Geronimo's flight, Crook was reprimanded, which led to his immediate resignation. Crook was replaced by Nelson Miles, known as Bear Coat, on April 12, 1886, with the full support of the War Department. He put 5,000 soldiers into the field, 500 Apache scouts, and thousands of irregular civilian militia out to find Geronimo and his army of 24 soldiers. The renegades went through the summer of 1886, constantly being pursued by American and Mexican soldiers. Geronimo and his men were finally found by Lieutenant Charles Gatewood and 2 Apache scouts. Geronimo laid his rifle down and shook hands with the Big Nose captain. He asked Big Nose about Bear Coat Miles. He wanted to know if he was cruel or kind-hearted. He also was he trustworthy and able to keep his promises? Gatewood assured Geronimo that he could trust General Miles, which led to Geronimo's surrender for the last time. Geronimo and his surviving men were shipped to Fort Marion, Florida. Many of his friends died there because of the warm, humid land which they were not used to. Also, consumption killed over 100 men. The efforts of George Crook, John Clum, and Hugh Scott, the Apaches would not have survived at the post on the Mobile River. The citizens of Arizona refused to let Geronimo's Chiricahuas within the state to live on a reservation again. Lieutenant Hugh Scott reached out to the Kiowas and Comanches, even though they had been enemies with the Apaches in the past. They offered to let the Apaches join them on the reservation. In 1894, Geronimo brought the surviving exiles to Fort Sill. He died in 1909, was buried in the Apache cemetery. He was the last of the Apache chiefs.